Hi everybody, I'm Meteorologist Pat Cavlin here at KHOU 11 News in Houston, Texas. We're going to do a little bit of an update here on the latest regarding Hurricane Melissa and the impacts that we're going to see through Jamaica and the rest of the Greater Antilles. As of the 10 a.m. advisory, 10 a.m. Central Time here in Texas for Monday, we are talking about a Category 5 hurricane with winds sustained now at 165 miles per hour. This is an increase from where we were with the early morning advisory. So Melissa continuing to show signs of strengthening here. Central pressure also now down to 908 millibars. Just take a look at the symmetry of the storm and how perfectly circular the most intense cold cloud tops are surrounding the eye of the storm. This storm is crawling along to the west at about 3 miles per hour, which means this is a storm that you could actually walk faster than. As a meteorologist, just by the first impression looking at this, you can tell it's a very healthy and destructive storm. And again, that goes back to what I was talking about with the symmetry of the system. Notice how the edges are perfectly rounded off here. There's no jaggedness to the tops of these clouds. So what we're looking at on the satellite here are cloud top temperatures. Okay, so the brighter the colors get here towards the middle of the storm with those whites and occasionally the purple showing up there within the white, that indicates some of the coldest cloud tops. And so for a meteorologist, what that tells us is that these are really intense thunderstorms. So how does that correlation happen? The stronger a thunderstorm is, the taller the cloud gets, right? So a thunderstorm is just a large cloud, right? So the stronger a thunderstorm, the taller the cloud. Well, the higher up in the atmosphere you go, the colder the temperatures are. And so what we do is we use satellite imagery to detect the temperature of those cloud tops. And so the colder the cloud top temperatures, the taller the thunderstorms and the more intense they are. So when you see a lot of these really cold cloud top temperatures showing up on satellite, that is an indication of high intensity, right? So when you see that big white ring around the eye of a hurricane, that indicates really intense thunderstorms producing really tall clouds and really cold cloud top temperatures. And so there's your intense presentation on satellite. The symmetry just owns to the organization of the storm, right? There's no wind shear working on this. There's no dry air getting into this. This is a perfectly symmetrical, self-sustaining engine of a storm. This is the most dangerous storm on planet Earth right now. So again, as of the 10 a.m. Central Advisory on this Monday morning, this storm is crawling to the west at about 3 miles per hour. Category 5 storm with 165 mile per hour sustained winds. Over the next 24 hours, this storm is not going to move much, but later today, we do expect it to finally go from westward movement to more of a north turn. And that north turn will eventually take it on course towards Jamaica. So notice by tomorrow morning, around 7 a.m., this is a Category 5 hurricane on the doorstep of making landfall in Jamaica. Remember, Category 5 strength starts with 157 mile per hour winds. So this will be a low-end Category 5 hurricane. Still though, that's just your sustained wind reading. You'll see wind gusts being produced from this, upwards of 170, 175, even 180 mile per hour as this makes landfall. And remember, there are parts of Jamaica that are very mountainous, and so the higher up you go in elevation, the stronger some of those wind gusts are going to be. So this is a destructive hurricane that's about to move on to onshore here in Jamaica as we get into Tuesday. The only bit of good news that I can give you is that even though the storm has been moving very slowly the last few days, once it starts to make that north turn, it starts to pick up speed. So we're not talking about a long duration storm over Jamaica where this will sit over the island for 2 or 3 days. No, instead, this will be over the island just for a few hours and then it races to the north. Next, it'll have its sights set on the eastern half of Cuba, making landfall either as a Category 2 or 3 hurricane, and from there will continue to race north, moving across the Turks and Caicos Wednesday afternoon and Wednesday evening. Probably is a high-end Cat 1 or low-end Cat 2 hurricane, and then eventually going out towards Bermuda as we get towards the end of the week. So things really start to accelerate here as we get into the next few days, but it's going to be a rough 24 to 48 hours for Jamaica and then for the eastern tip of Cuba. So let's take you through it here on Future Track. And notice it's going to be hours and hours and hours of torrential rainfall here across Jamaica. Notice the center of the storm still 50 to 70 miles to the south of the island later this evening. However, we're still getting pummeled with nonstop rainfall. So this is the first element of the storm that's going to be causing widespread destruction and issues across Jamaica, and even as you get into Cuba as well, just in the form of heavy rain, which will produce flash flooding and also a mudslide threat. The worst of the storm, though, finally starts to creep onshore as we get into the early morning hours Tuesday. So I think conditions rapidly start to deteriorate in terms of wind gusts, probably around 3 to 4 o'clock in the morning. That will accelerate as the storm begins to move northward and push on shore. Now, the current thinking from the National Hurricane Center forecast and also from some of our higher resolution models is that landfall will be displaced towards the western side of the island. So Kingston gets some of the worst of the weather as we get into the evening hours tonight and through the overnight. But the worst in terms of wind field will be here across the western half of the island. Mudslides, torrential rainfall here through the mountainous terrain, through the middle part of the island, and then eventually the eye moves across the island, eventually moving offshore by 11 a.m. So again, like I said, this isn't going to be an all-day long duration event. The storm makes landfall around 5 a.m. It's back over open water before noon, and then from there continues over Cuba. That being said, we're talking about incredible amounts of rainfall over the next few hours. On average across Jamaica, 15 to 30 inches, and that will be enhanced. You know, there are some spots in here that we don't have pinpoints, to plot on the map, but in some of these mountainous towns, you could see upwards of 40 or more inches of rain. And so that's where the mudslide threat is going to become a major concern here over the next 18 to 24 hours. Kingston, 10 inches of rain. I think that's conservative. I think you could end up with about 15 inches of rain. Montego Bay, I think you could also end up with about 15 inches of rain. But again, it's once you get into the nooks and crannies and the mountainous terrain here of the island where you could see 25, 30, 40 inches of rain by the time it's all said and done. Same deal with Cuba. Again, mountainous terrain here. This is where you're going to squeeze even more moisture out of the atmosphere once the thunderstorms that are associated with this hurricane get pushed up the mountain. I mean, think about taking a sponge and you're just squeezing everything that the atmosphere has out of it. And so this is where those rain totals are really going to start to rack up very quickly here. Again, 20, 30, 40 inches of rain, not out of the question for a lot of these locations. Now let's talk about wind. Again, Kingston here on the eastern half of the island. You've got Montego Bay, these other smaller towns here on the western half of the island. And watch this, 10:30 tonight, we're talking about strong tropical storm force winds across the entire island. Once we get beyond midnight, though, this is where things really start to rapidly deteriorate. Again, 3 to 4 a.m. Kingston, you're still going to stay around probably 50 to 70 mile per hour winds. But it's really once you get towards the western half of the island, we're talking about 90, 95, 100 mile per hour winds. There's your landfall point, 130, 140 mile per hour winds. And again, wherever the exact landfall point is, wherever you're going through the immediate eye wall of this storm, where the winds are sustained at 150, 160 miles per hour, this is where you could see gusts even upwards of 170 to 180 miles per hour. So the worst of it will be very localized, but where it is the worst, you're talking about absolute catastrophic damage. So it's so important that hopefully the people that are in this part of the island are able, I understand you can't get off the island, but at least get to the eastern half of the island while there's still some time, because this is where the wind damage is just going to make life absolutely uninhabitable, probably for weeks on end, unfortunately. So we're talking about 130, 140 mile per hour winds. The eye moves across the western half of the island. We get the worst of it then in Montego Bay tomorrow morning. Talking about 110, 120 mile per hour sustained winds. Kingston still dealing with consistent 50 to 70 mile per hour winds. And then eventually, as we get into the afternoon, everything starts to move north, but the wind flow here continues to come in from the south. So storm surge and coastal flooding, a major concern here, especially as the winds shift around here on the eastern half of the island. We're going to see big problems with that. So it's a multi-tiered storm. You're talking about wind damage threat, you're talking about rainfall flooding, and also coastal flooding. Again, though, the satellite presentation is just what's so impressive. You've got that perfectly circular eye here. We haven't seen any type of weakness in that eye now for the last 12 hours. This is a 12-hour satellite loop. And also look at how this storm has barely moved. You could walk faster than this thing, only moving at 3 miles per hour. Now, we have seen that westward movement, and just keep an eye on how the storm doesn't really wobble much on my hand. In fact, it's starting to track a little bit of, to the south, a little bit of a southward wobble there. That's probably the last bit of a southward movement that we're going to see before it starts to take that turn towards the north. Now, that northward turn and where that happens will be important because it'll really determine where we see the worst of the impacts there on the western half of the island, where the immediate landfall point is. But again, I think Kingston's in the clear from the immediate impacts of the wind damage, but the rainfall will be the worst here, I think, on the eastern side of the storm, going all the way up across the island here. So just a remarkable satellite imagery here. This is, again, the most devastating storm on planet Earth right now. For the United States, there were some concerns last week about whether or not this storm could eventually take a turn into the United States. And here it is on Future Track. We're going to take this out now the next 2 days, and I'll show you why we're not as concerned with that anymore. Notice we see landfall in Jamaica tomorrow, Cuba tomorrow evening, through the Turks and Caicos, and then across the U.S., a perfectly timed cold front starts to push in. And this powerful fall front will be strong enough to push Melissa away from the U.S. and eventually out to sea as we get towards Wednesday and Thursday, potentially impacting Bermuda as we get towards Thursday and Friday. But again, no impacts for Florida or for the East Coast, but a devastating storm down through Jamaica and the Greater Antilles. Stay with us here on KHOU. We're posting these tropical update videos on KHOU 11+. We're also posting them on YouTube so that you can follow along wherever you are. We're going to be doing these updates as we go through the rest of today, tomorrow, and the days to come about the impacts from the storm and the aftermath across the islands.